Fabulous. Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. It's the first training I've actually done since joining Asthma Lung UK Scotland. So it's really, really nice to be invited along to speak to you a little bit about campaigning for to tackle toxic air in your community. So my name's Maddy. I am the Regional Campaigns and Policy Officer for Asthma and Lung UK Scotland. And my remit is looking after our clean air campaign, specifically in Glasgow. So this session is going to be covering a little bit about the air pollution problem in Glasgow. I'm not sure what you already know about it, so I will sort of cover the basics, but feel free to shout up if you know all this stuff. That's absolutely fine. It's quite a small group. I will talk a little bit about local campaigning, so why you should be interested in campaigning locally, and also a few top tips as well. So the aim is really to hopefully just give you an understanding of the threat of air pollution, but also to empower you to know that change is possible, and to give you the tools to be able to make that change. So a quick summary of what we'll cover. I'll talk about Asthma and Lung UK, specifically Asthma and Lung UK Scotland and what we do. I'll talk a little bit about air pollution in Glasgow and why it's a local problem. Then I'll cover what the strategies are, so what can actually be done on a local level to tackle toxic air, why campaign locally and how local campaigns can make an impact, top tips, and then next steps. And as Leanne said, we should have time for questions at the end. I won't be able to keep an eye on the chat. I'm sure Leanne will. But yeah, do save those questions and thoughts. It'll be great to hear them. So firstly, just a little bit about us at Asthma and Lung UK Scotland. So we're the leading lung health charity in Scotland and the UK. So we work in all the 4 nations, and we represent the 1 in 5 people who are living with a lung condition. Sometimes people can be a bit surprised to hear that 1 in 5 people are living with a lung condition. It's a lot more common than a lot of people think. And the main lung conditions are, and obviously that we concentrate on as a result, asthma, COPD, IPF, so idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, obstructive sleep apnea, bronchiectasis, and we've also started working on long COVID. And all of this is alongside a bit of work we do as well to call for better screening for lung cancer through a national screening programme. And why do we do this? Well, the reason is, across the UK, every 10 seconds, someone has an asthma attack. Sadly, every 5 minutes, somebody will die from a lung condition. 1 in 5 people will experience a lung condition, and lung conditions are actually the 3rd biggest killer in the UK, which is another thing that tends to surprise people. It doesn't really occur to them. And just briefly, this is a kind of snapshot of our strategy at Asthma Lung UK Scotland, and it sort of highlights the key aspects of our work. So we shine a light on the need for better lung health and tackle any negative attitudes that hold back progress. We are looking at investment in life-saving research. So we do this through sort of fighting for more public funding and also our own research. We fight for clean air for all, wherever you live or are born in the UK, which is what this presentation is about. We ensure that everyone who needs a diagnosis of their lung condition gets one as quickly as possible. We actually provide some treatment and support ourselves. So we have a services team with a great helpline of respiratory nurses, which can be really helpful for people to know, especially parents of children with asthma. You can give our helpline a call and you can get through to a respiratory nurse. Not many people know about that, and it's a really great asset. And finally, bringing together everyone affected by a lung condition to make our voices heard. So on to the issue of air pollution, and air pollution is the biggest environmental threat to human health, which is not something that people always know. I think a lot of people sort of view air pollution through an environmental lens, which is equally very important. But in terms of air pollution as a health issue, public awareness is generally quite low. So it might surprise people to know that air pollution causes an estimated 2,500 deaths each year in Scotland. And this is sort of disproportionately weighted towards city regions, given they tend to be more polluted. And the health impacts of air pollution, there's quite a few. So firstly, with regards to lung conditions such as asthma, air pollution can be a contributory factor to developing lung conditions, but also they can be a major trigger for lung conditions in asthma, sort of resulting in worsening asthma attacks and, unfortunately, even fatal asthma attacks. Air pollution's also been proven to be linked to heart disease. So a lot of pollutants can enter through our lungs and go into our bloodstreams, where they wreak all sorts of havoc. More and more research is now linking air pollution to the development of dementia and also obesity. And then finally, decreased lung development for children and young people. So this training is super relevant because children are disproportionately affected by air pollution. They're sort of at exhaust height when it comes to sort of motor vehicles, but also once those pollutants have been inhaled, they're causing a lot more problems for young lungs than sort of fully grown ones. So you might have heard before of a little girl called Ella Kitty Deborah. So Ella was a little girl from Lewisham in London. And sadly, in 2013, 3 weeks before her 9th birthday, she died from a fatal asthma attack. So the area that Ella lived in Lewisham was near a road that was actually an air pollution hotspot. But Rosamond, Ella's mum, only found this out after Ella's death. So in the last weeks and months of Ella's life, she was suffering asthma attacks of increasing intensity, but no health professional actually told Rosamond that air pollution could be to blame for that. And it was only after an inquest into Ella's death where the coroner found that air pollution was a significant contributory factor to her death. And Ella actually became the first person to have air pollution as a cause of death on her death certificate. So a really awful story. Rosamond, Ella's mum, is now a tireless activist for clean air. She campaigns locally in London, but also on a national and an international scale. She's a really brilliant woman. So when we talk about air pollution, what exactly are we referring to? So the main pollutants of concern are particulate matter. So you'll see this referred to as PM10 and PM2.5. And this is literally small toxic particles. Sometimes people refer to it as dust because that's essentially what it is. PM10 being the bigger particles and PM2.5 being the smaller ones. Nitrogen dioxide, so that is a gas, and as is sulfur dioxide, so NO2 and SO2. And then another pollutant of concern is ozone, so O3. And when people refer to smog and when sort of the air looks hazy, that's often to do with ozone. So Asthma Lung UK Scotland works quite specifically on air pollution caused by motor vehicles at the moment. We do a little bit of work on some other causes of air pollution, but really road transport is our major focus. And you can see from these diagrams, road transport is the leading cause of nitrogen dioxide and the third most common cause of particulate matter. And just to make particulate matter a little bit more tangible, because I know these terms can be a bit scientific and it's hard to really wrap your head around what it means. This diagram compares particulate matter to the size of a human hair and a grain of sand. So you can see that you can fit several PM10 within the width of a human hair, and then another several PM2.5 within the width of a PM10. So these are really tiny particles that we're talking about. And don't be misled by the size of them to think that they're not an issue, because the main problem with the size of PM2.5 especially is that they've been proven to travel really deep into the respiratory tract, reaching sort of the farthest corners of the lungs. It can go into the bloodstream, and yeah, as I say, wreak all sorts of havoc. So you can understand why inhaling particulate matter can be really harmful to health. And then I also wanted to touch on how inequalities are linked with air pollution and lung health, especially because, as I'm sure we're all aware, Glasgow is a city of quite stark health inequalities. So 7 times more likely to die from a respiratory condition in the poorest compared to the richest neighbourhoods. 85% of people living in areas with illegal levels of nitrogen dioxide make up the poorest 20% of the UK population. And this is despite the fact that people on lower incomes are much less likely to own a car. So they're not the people who are contributing to the problem as much. And that's especially the case in Glasgow. So Glasgow's actually got some of the lowest car ownership in the whole of Scotland. But we do see that it has incredibly high levels of air pollution. And then 54% of those on the lowest incomes have uncontrolled asthma. So air pollution is linked to sort of societal inequalities. So to make it more specific to Glasgow, I thought we'd have a little look at what the data is saying. So the best way to understand how a region's performing when it comes to air quality is to look at how it compares to the World Health Organization guidelines. So the World Health Organization, I'll call them the WHO, states there's no safe level of air pollution. And I think that's really important to emphasize. There's really no kind of safe level of exposure here. But their guidelines are a recommended annual maximum that people should be exposed to in order to, remain safe. So how does Glasgow stack up? If we look at this table, we've got the main pollutants, we've got nitrogen dioxide at the top, particulate matter 10, and then particulate matter 2.5. So firstly, for nitrogen dioxide, you can see that Glasgow is way over the WHO recommended maximum. So 10 micrograms is the recommended amount. Glasgow last year was averaging, and when I say Glasgow, I'm talking specifically the urban area in this instance, was averaging 45 micrograms. So that's 4.5 times what the World Health Organization recommends. And then with PM10, we can see Glasgow's not doing too badly, actually. It's just slightly over. But for PM 2.5 again, we're almost double there. So the WHO recommends 5 micrograms maximum. Glasgow's averaging at 9, so nearly 2 times. So these are the region-wide averages for Glasgow, but it's also important to mention that air quality can actually vary quite significantly depending on specific location. So to take an example, Hope Street in the city centre has actually repeatedly been ranked as Scotland's most polluted street. And until last year, it was exceeding not only the WHO guidelines significantly, but it was actually going over Scottish legal levels as well, which is somewhat impressive because the Scottish legal limits for air pollution are actually a lot higher than the current WHO guidance. So sort of proximity to traffic, proximity to idling engines, these are huge contributors to toxic air. So it sort of makes you think about specific locations, such as your schools, for example, at drop-off times, what are the roads looking like, and are they congested with traffic, and who is inhaling that pollution? And just to bring home what the data actually means, I just wanted to show you this quote from one of our storytellers, Anthony, to highlight the human impact of air pollution. So Anthony mentioned that he actually had a week-long hospital visit after having an asthma attack whilst visiting friends in Glasgow. And he cited that the smog in towns is responsible for triggering his symptoms. Okay. So now I've sufficiently depressed everyone with what a terrible situation Glasgow has on its hands with air pollution. I wanted to talk a bit about the strategies to tackle toxic air. because we do know the solutions. There's many, and not all of them are perfect, it's worth saying, but there are several strategies that can be employed that we know work when it comes to tackling air pollution. So the first one, and by far the most controversial one, is low emission zones. So when it comes to low emission zones, and I'm sure you're all more than aware of these, given that Glasgow's is coming into force in a couple of weeks. The idea with them is that they prohibit the most polluting vehicles from driving within the zone. And it's meant to encourage people to switch to active travel options, public transport, or at least to use less polluting vehicles. And when sufficiently ambitious, low emission zones have been proven to be a highly effective way at reducing pollution quite fast. So there's the example of the ultra low emission zone in London. That's been successful in reducing air pollution in central London by almost half. So whilst we appreciate low emission zones can be somewhat contentious, and it's really important that people who need exemptions in the zone are able to get those, because some people do have to use their vehicles for mobility reasons. And also it's important that, you know, grace and transition periods are fair. Low emission zones, they do the job, essentially. Then we have tackling engine idling, especially outside of schools, as another strategy. So idling engines actually burn fuel less efficiently, and so they often produce more emissions than a vehicle when it's in motion, which often surprises people. Engine idling outside of schools is particularly an issue because, as I've mentioned, little lungs are more vulnerable to the effects of air pollution, closer to the cause of the pollution. They have a higher prevalence of asthma in children, and pollutants can actually stunt lung growth, as I mentioned. So measures to stop idling, such as public awareness campaigns, fines for people who idle their engines, and school streets, which I'm sure you're aware, they sort of block the roads at schools at peak times. These are all ways that we can reduce what is essentially a very needless contributor to Glasgow's toxic air. And it can be so easy to forget about idling your engine. I will hold my hands up and say, a couple of months ago, me and my partner were going out, we got in the car, we turned the engine on, and then we started browsing Spotify to see what music we were going to listen to during the drive. And all of a sudden I remembered, and I absolutely kicked myself knowing that we'd been sat there idling the engine. So it's really good to just try and think twice, because, as I say, it's just such a needless but still pretty significant cause of emissions. The next one is a biggie for many places across Scotland and the UK, but it's picked up quite a bit of traction in Glasgow specifically, and that's improving the public transport system. So something quite interesting is that Philip Alston, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty and Human Rights, published a report a couple of years ago which linked the privatisation of public transport in the UK to human rights, and basically called it a human rights issue. And he points out that the UK's a massive anomaly in Europe, because the majority of European public transport is publicly owned. And you might have noticed, this is a bit of a generalisation, but in many countries across Europe, it's cheaper to take the bus or the train. It can be more efficient, and the timetables sort of line up a little bit better. So at present, obviously Glasgow's bus services are privately owned. They're not very well integrated with one another, and they're not very well integrated with the subway or the trains. So it's really important, especially if we're going to introduce measures like the low emission zones, and we want to tell people, you know, to use their cars less, that we actually have an accessible, reliable and affordable public transport system. And Glasgow has the potential for this. The way that the system's structured means it could be a world-class system. It's just this potential at the moment, it's just not being seized by the decision makers. So at a minimum, we need to see some sort of integration, some sort of smart ticketing, to make life a little bit easier for people to take it. Active travel is, of course, the least polluting way to get from A to B. So as a health charity, obviously, we support it, but also want to emphasise we're aware that not everyone can participate in active travel. But for those that can, walking, cycling, wheeling are really great ways to get across the city without adding to the toxic air issue. But safety is key. So we need to see more segregated cycle lanes, for example, and a wider redesigning of the city to be designed for people rather than cars. So at the moment, car is king, the roads are designed for cars, but really cities are hubs for people to live in and to meet in. So they need to be designed more for people. And I use this picture, it's a little bit grainy, but it's of Shoreland's bike bus. You might have heard of it. I actually heard of it through Leanne, but it's a big group of parents and kids all cycling to school together en masse to create that kind of safety in numbers, which is really amazing and just shows what can be done. And then the last strategy I want to talk about is improving air quality monitoring. This is obviously not a strategy in and of itself that improves the air quality, but the idea is if we have more place-specific data, that gives us more evidence to back up the other strategies to tackle the pollution. So at the minute, air quality data in Glasgow is fairly weak. There's a few monitors in a few sort of hotspots. We know that the figures we're getting back is that the pollution is really high, but it's actually good practice to have monitors across the whole city and especially outside of schools, healthcare centres, care homes, because this is where the most vulnerable people are who are most affected by air pollution. So a proliferation of monitors means more data, more understanding of the problem, and then more impetus for change. And the last thing I'll say on this point is that if people have specific and accurate air quality data, they can make informed decisions about their health. So something our beneficiaries tell us quite often is that air pollution triggers their lung conditions, but they don't know when it's a bad pollution day. So to actually have that information, they can be empowered to modify their behaviours, which realistically they shouldn't have to do. We should be working to clean the air so they don't have to miss out. But some people would, you know, sooner stay home than have a really bad asthma attack. Okay, so now we've talked about air pollution as an issue and we've talked about air pollution in Glasgow. I wanted to pivot slightly to talk about local campaigning. So why would we fight for change on a local level and how to do so? I've kind of designed it so it's applicable not just to air quality campaigning, but it could be for any campaign you wanted to run, as I'm sure there's sort of a plethora of issues that you might be interested in. So firstly, just very basic, I'm sure all of you know what campaigning is. It's working in an organised way towards a specific goal, and that goal is often political or social. And when it comes to this kind of campaigning, we can divide it into three sort of broad areas. So we've got awareness raising, bringing an issue into the public consciousness, because people can't care and get active about something that they really know nothing about. And this is really important with air pollution because, as I mentioned, a lot of people don't know the extent of the issue. They don't know that it's a health problem. Then there's the advocacy side of campaigning. So this is influencing policy or decision makers to create a tangible change. And that can take many forms, and we'll talk about them a little later in the presentation. But, you know, there's direct influencing by meeting decision makers, public pressure through petitions or social media or protests. But when it comes to advocacy, you're campaigning for a change to sort of policy or law. And then we've got behavioural change. So it speaks for itself, encouraging individuals to change their behaviour for the better. Because often we learn by the example of others in our immediate groups and communities, and encouraging people to use their cars less, switch off their engines when they're not using it, or walk their kids to school, for example, is all campaigning as well. But some of the best campaigns and the vast majority of very successful campaigns include a mix of all three of these things, because I'm a believer that in order to create long-lasting, meaningful change, really need to be bringing people along in a genuine way. So that would include not just the advocacy to change the policy, but also the awareness and the behavioural change as well. So why campaign locally? When we talk about local campaigns, we're talking about stuff in your immediate sort of city or region. So stuff that's involving people in your community and affecting a change that impacts your daily lives. But you might wonder, if the majority of laws and policies are sort of coming from Holyrood, why would we want to campaign locally? So firstly, in the context of air pollution, many of the strategies to tackle the problem actually sit within the local government's remit. So even though a lot of decisions on air quality are made at a Scottish Parliament level, and they have a strategy for that, many of the strategies to tackle the problem actually fall within a local government umbrella. So, for example, introducing school streets is within their powers, running anti-idling campaigns, investing in air quality monitoring, all the way to redesigning the city to be better for pedestrians. It's all doable by the local council. So there are very viable targets for campaigning. Secondly, strength can build upwards in many ways. So local authorities look to each other for positive examples. So a change in Glasgow could be echoed in another council. And then if several local authorities all make a certain change, that demonstrates to central government that there's an appetite for the change. And because it's already happened in so many places, it then becomes a bit of a low-hanging fruit. So it's very easy for central government to then put it into national policy and law. And then also a lot of local stakeholders, so say local councillors, are in close contact with your MSPs and your MPs. So that's another way it can go up the chain. I know, for example, some councillors in the Glasgow City Council are staffers for MSPs, so they're in daily contact with them. So that's a real sort of clear, tangible way that things can sort of go up the chain to a national level. It's empowering to campaign locally. We often only have a say in local affairs at the ballot box, perhaps not yourselves because you're actually quite active members of your local community. But yeah, there's so much chance to make change and to be active citizens. The mechanisms exist in our democracy. They don't always work particularly well, but they're there. And so joining together with like-minded people in your community to make a change to your area and to improve your livelihoods it's a really nice thing to be able to do. And then lastly, oftentimes local decision makers can be more accessible than those on a national level. So generally speaking, to get hold of your local councillor or your council officer is easier than, you know, a government minister or a civil servant. So yeah, it's a good way to be able to actually meet them face to face, which is not possible with some of these higher level decision makers. So very quickly, I'm going to whiz through this part actually, because I think you probably already have this knowledge. So I just wanted to talk about what role the local government plays and what power they have. So local councils' responsibilities is public services, so education, social care, waste management, planning, parks, and they also have other responsibilities that as mandated by national government. And what that means when it comes to air pollution, they're responsible for implementing any measures that the central government mandates. So for example, with the low emission zone, Glasgow City Council was instructed by central government to introduce that zone. They were told to do it. But then also the local government has autonomy over some measures that are encompassed within their responsibilities. So as I mentioned, a lot of clean air stuff does fall within that public service remit. Worth just saying as well, if something you want to campaign on does exceed the local government's power, it's worth lobbying your councillor anyway, because they're members of parties. As I say, they have access to MPs, and they can actually campaign on sort of your behalf. So it can be a more accessible way to tackle a number of issues, even if it doesn't fall within their sort of portfolio. The role of councillors. So you've got your local councillor. Your local councillor serves to be a bridge between the community and the council as a whole. They advocate for local residents, and they can lead campaigns on behalf of their residents, as I mentioned. You also have within councils, councillors that have sort of special responsibilities and portfolios, and they'll lead on specific areas of work. So sometimes these can be conveners. For example, in Glasgow, again, City Council, there's the convener for climate and transport. His sort of remit covers air pollution. There's also various committees within councils, and those are chaired by a specific councillor. So these are really good people to approach with regards to your issue. And you can find out details of these people, the council's structure, different people's roles, and their contact details on your local council's website. So I would recommend having a look. And then obviously each council has a leader. So that is more for sort of strategic direction. And then just to quickly touch on the role of MSPs and MPs. So members of Scottish Parliament, they advocate for constituents at a parliamentary level. They can make change on devolved matters, and air pollution is one of those. And they can have influence on local matters. So even if it's something that sits within a local government remit, MSPs and MPs can also help to create change sort of indirectly. They can add pressure on local councils. Quite often they get involved with press and holding the local council to account. So it is still worth engaging with them on local campaigns. And then you've got your members of parliament. So they can represent constituents and Scotland more widely in the Houses of Parliament. And they have influence on non-devolved issues as well. And again, you can find out who your local MSPs are and who your MP is at, there's a website called They Work For You, which I'm sure some of you will have seen before, as I say, again, being quite active members of the community. So now we've talked about who the main stakeholders are on a local level. I wanted to give some top tips on how to campaign effectively. So firstly, how to engage with decision makers. It sounds really basic, but I think a lot of people don't really know where to start with contacting their local councillor or local MSP, and they don't know what the most effective way to do that is. So first off, by far the most impactful way that you can create change is to meet with your local decision maker. So you can attend their surgeries. Many of them advertise times on their social media pages or on the local council websites. And they sort of have that dedicated time to be meeting with their constituents to talk about issues that matter to them. So if you can go along to that, that's the time that you know they're going to be there. You know you'll have their time and attention. You can also request one-to-one meetings. I think people can be a little bit hesitant to do this because they know how busy local councillors and MSPs can be, and they think that they can't ask for their time. But actually, these people are elected to represent you, and they will have time dedicated to meeting constituents to discuss matters, things that matter to them. So do approach them. And also, if you don't get a meeting at first attempt, don't be disheartened. A lot of the time with campaigning, unfortunately, it doesn't tend to always be how worthy the cause is, but actually who kind of shouts the loudest. So do be persistent. And then finally, if you're struggling to meet them, it can be useful to find out what events that they're attending. Not in an ambushing kind of way, more in sort of a sense of, you know, local councils sometimes have events for local people where they talk about upcoming plans. So if you know that your local council is going to be there, or even your MSP is going to be there, go along and approach them. If you can't get a meeting with them, I would say it's second best to try and give them a call, or at least try and arrange a call. The reason I say this is because, as I'm sure you're all aware, a conversation is just so much more impactful than written correspondence a lot of the time. It allows you to have their sort of dedicated attention within that period of time. You can go into a lot more detail and you can establish a rapport with them. So yeah, you can find the sort of details of the telephone number for their office. Give them a ring, especially if you're not hearing back from them, because that can help bump you to sort of the top of their mental list, because a lot of them have a massive caseload. And again, it's going to be those people that kind of shout the loudest that are going to get their time and attention. Writing to them is the next sort of best way. Email obviously does the job, and I think as a first point of contact, email can be really great, but local sort of decision makers do receive a really high volume of emails, so it can be hard to make them stand out, and sometimes you do find yourself chasing them time and time again to get a response. So something I found, and I realized this when working with some volunteers in a previous job actually, that handwritten letters, or even typed and printed letters, but especially handwritten, because it's quite personal, they actually do really well with decision makers and can often provoke quite a meaningful response. And also, if you're sending something in the post, it's an opportunity to get a bit crafty if you want to. You could work with the kids to create something a little bit creative, helps you to stand out and helps you to tug on the heartstrings of decision makers, which is never a bad thing. And then tweeting them, well, or using social media in general. So local decision makers are usually quite active on social media. They care a lot about their public profile. So if you've tried other avenues and you're not getting a response, it can be effective to tweet them or respond to one of their tweets. It takes it into the public realm. They're going to look really bad for not replying to you on a public platform. So if you are struggling, I would recommend, reaching out to them via Twitter. Of course, always being polite and cordial. So onto the sort of content of your conversations with decision makers, because this is really important to make sure that it's impactful. Counsellors and MSPs speak to a lot of people. They speak to a lot of organisations. And in order to be effective in your campaigning, it's really important to make sure that that decision maker goes away and they remember what you've told them. And I've split this into 3 sections. So you've got hearts, so appealing to emotions. I call this heads, but it should be a head icon really, but it's not. It's a piece of paper. But what this means is to sort of appeal to sort of rational and data-driven sort of aspects. And then there's hands, and that is making it easy for them. And I'll go into detail about what each of these means. So when it comes to hearts, it's proven time and time again that the most effective way to motivate anybody, and this includes decision makers because they're all people at the end of the day, is by sharing stories. So people connect with stories. They stick in our mind, often better than facts and figures, and they have the ability to make us connect with one another and to issues that move us. So one of the most effective things that you can do, and that's why at Asthma Lung UK Scotland, we actually have a whole sort of department dedicated to storytelling, is to share your story. If it's about air pollution, how has air pollution in Glasgow affected you? How has it affected your child? Has it exacerbated a condition you've got? Has it affected your well-being or mental health, which is something we're hearing more and more of? If you don't have a personal story, you could always share someone else's. I say this with the caveat, please do get their permission. But, telling a local decision maker about a family member or a friend who's been affected, or even a story in the news. So like little Ella that we discussed earlier, using these stories can really bring home the human impact of the issue that you're trying to raise awareness of. There's also empowering young voices. So hearing from children and young people often makes an impact. I think people tend to feel more empathy and compassion for children. And when it comes to decision makers, I think sometimes they feel guiltier and maybe a little bit worried about their public profile if they're seen to be ignoring children. So we actually have had a really good meeting with Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, where a group of parents brought along their children to talk directly to him about why clean air matters. And he was absolutely enthralled with the kids. It can be a really effective way to campaign, but also a really lovely way to empower your kids and introduce them to activism and community work at a young age, which is never a bad thing. And then lastly on this point, appealing to the decision makers' interests. So this is where doing a bit of research comes in and finding out what matters to them. What do they talk about on their social media, in the press? What do they talk about in, the council or in Parliament? Because every decision maker has their pet interests. And if you can make your issue relevant to them, you'll have more of a chance of making an impact on them and getting them to act. Okay, on to the sort of head side of things. Whilst decision makers are people and they will be motivated by stories, they're going to need the facts and figures to back up any action, as they'll inevitably face these questions if they do bring the issue forward to council or Parliament. So it's really important to be armed with the right information. So for example, as I said earlier, many people just don't know that air pollution is contributing to so many fatalities in Scotland. So giving them these figures can be quite an eye-opener. Or also using, air pollution data. It's an indisputable fact that the air pollution in Glasgow was 4.5 times World Health Organization levels. That's really hard to disagree with when the data is there. Make the data relevant to your community. So it's good to say how it's affecting Scotland as a whole, but how is it affecting Glasgow specifically? Or even more granularly, how is it affecting your school or your local ward? If you can get that data or anything that sort of makes it just a little bit more specific, that's going to motivate your local decision makers, because their absolute priority is stuff that affects their local area. Keep it simple. So don't send lots of complicated data that's presented inaccessibly. This is going to make them unlikely to look at it. If it's complicated, if they need time to get their heads around it, it's going to be a deterrent to them looking into it. So keep to a few key hard-hitting stats that are easy to interpret, and that'll be most effective. And lastly on this one, if there's gaps in the evidence, this doesn't always necessarily make your argument weaker. For example, with air pollution, the lack of air pollution monitoring and the lack of data we've actually got is more of a reason to tackle it, because we know that the sites that we do have are showing that we're way above safe levels, but we don't know what it's like outside of your home or your school or your GP surgery. So tell them that this data doesn't exist. I think admitting that is an issue in and of itself that needs solving, so it doesn't hurt your argument. And then we've got hands. So how can we help give them the answers? And it might sound a bit silly because it's their job really to have the answers, but in reality, a lot of decision makers will take the path of least resistance given how busy their caseload is. So if you come to them with suggested solutions to your issue, you can make it sound so easy that it's ridiculous that they've not done it already. It's also important to demonstrate popular support. So they're far more likely to act if you can show that a lot of people care about it. It's not just a niche issue. It's not something that just affects you. There's actually loads of people in the local community that want to see this change made. So getting a petition going, getting a group of parents to co-sign a letter or a group of schools, shows a united front and shows strength in numbers. And then focus on solutions, not problems. So whilst we want to highlight that air pollution is a really serious issue, we also want to show that it's solvable. So with the right political will and the right action, this can be tackled. So that's where you bring in, you know, your school streets, your cycle lanes, your integrated transport, and so on. On to a few campaigning tactics. So now we know how to effectively engage with decision makers. How can we campaign and get people involved? As I mentioned, showing that there's popular support through stuff like petitions is really good, A, for raising awareness, but also demonstrating that public backing. So change.org is a good platform, for example. They can actually help promote petitions that seem to be doing well, which is good. Local decision makers don't have to do anything in response to a petition, but when signatures are growing, it does add the pressure. And make them aware of it as well. Share it with them on social media, do a petition hand-in once you've got plenty of signatures, and make sure they know that so many people are behind this. I realize the screenshot I chose had 18 million signatures. You might not get there with your campaigns, but all the same, showing that popular support. Using social media, obviously in 2023, is a massive element. Decision makers, politicians tend to be sort of centered around Twitter, especially. So targeting them on there is a really great way to get their attention. Again, I say targeting, I mean in a polite way. It's fine to be firm. We obviously don't want anyone harassing decision makers. But yeah, tweeting them, responding to tweets, maybe even developing a specific campaign hashtag. In one job, we did something called a tweet storm, where we developed a specific campaign hashtag and got so many people to send it within 1 hour that it actually got trending. And then that was great for a media story. So that can be a really good way to get attention to your campaign. Taking part in consultations. So consultations on a local level and even a national level happen really often. But the issue is they're not always well publicised, and sometimes that can be a bit strategic because the government has to consult local people, but maybe they don't want to do it meaningfully. They don't want to put a lot of resources in. So they stick a page up on their website and nobody knows that it's there. So no one knows that the consultation's going on. So yeah, sometimes they're sort of web-based forms and surveys, but sometimes they're in person or virtual as a focus group. So a way to check what's happening and to keep an eye is to look at your sort of local council website, your social media accounts, and if they consult on an issue that's relevant to your campaign, make sure that you put yourself forward to be involved. Reading party manifestos and local manifestos is a really great way to A, be in the know of what a local party has said that they're going to work on, and B, to hold them accountable. So if a party has said in Glasgow they're going to work on XYZ for clean air, you can then hold them to that standard because they made a promise and then they've been voted in, so they need to fulfill that promise. So it's always good to have a quick scan of local manifestos to see if there's any nuggets in there that you can work with. And in a similar vein, election time. So other than obviously, please vote in local elections and vote for those people that support your issue, tactically campaigning around election time is really beneficial because at the end of the day, this is the time when councillors, they want to get elected, they will then adopt policies that make them electable. So if you can show that a lot of people locally are in support of, for example, clean air policies, the local decision maker is going to think that the local candidate rather, is going to see that as increasing their chance of being elected if they say that they're going to work on it. So around election time, meeting with candidates, getting them to make commitments on clean air or other issues is a really sort of opportune moment to get your campaign out there. sort of for parents specifically, media wise, the press loves parents and children, and I'm sure Leanne knows this because Leanne has done so much amazing press work. They really do love to lead with stories about children and parents. So becoming a storyteller, whether that's just off your own back or getting involved with a charity like Asthma Lung, can bring your campaign to local media, and as with this case, even to national media. And then hosting events and grouping together. So the bottom picture is a group called Mums for Lungs. They're a campaigning group you might have heard of, but they're essentially united by a common thing. And it's because they're all mums and they're all concerned about air pollution. And their sort of USP initially was that you're all sort of in the same place. You can spread the word at the school gates. You can use schoolrooms as a meeting place to host, one of your campaign meetings. So I think with parents, you've got a really unique opportunity that you can find that shared concern for your kids, and you're all sort of, as I say, you're meeting regularly already. So it's a really great way to establish a campaign, and you're quite sort of uniquely positioned in that way. Staying informed. So as I mentioned with the consultations, it can be really hard to know what on earth is going on in local government sometimes because it's just not always well communicated. So I've used the example here with Glasgow City Council specifically, but I imagine it's the same for other city councils too, that you can watch their committee meetings and read minutes. Now, it can be incredibly boring. I've sat through a couple myself, but if there's a debate or committee that's really relevant to you, it is worth tuning in just to see what was discussed. And then you can mention that specifically to your councillor. You can say, you tuned in, you saw that they said this, and it just makes you seem really in the know, and keeps you informed. And then obviously following the council on socials. Glasgow City Council, for example, is quite prolific. They tweet quite a lot. So it can keep you in the know of what they're up to and developments on your issue. And I'd be remiss not to do a bit of a plug for Clean Air Champions, which is an Asthma and Lung UK initiative. It's a UK-wide programme to get schools working for clean air. So essentially what it is, if a school signs up to be a Clean Air Champion school, over a term, the kids will be involved in doing an awareness activity for clean air, a campaigning activity, and a fundraising activity. And if the kids in the school complete all three of those, they get to become a Clean Air Champion school. And Asthma and Lung supports them with resources and materials and can send them little certificates once they've completed it. So it's a really great scheme run by our community fundraising team. We've actually not got any schools in Glasgow signed up. So if you think it sounds good for your child's school, you can get the information on our website, or you can email me after the fact. I'll share my email address in the chat. So please do let me know if you're interested. So what's next? Firstly, I've talked an awful lot at you. I've just looked at the timer. It's been 54 minutes. I can't see you, so I really hope you're still with me. Go away and process. There's a lot of information. Let it sink in. Leanne's recorded this, so if you want to go back and watch any bits to pick up tips, take some screenshots, please do, and start to sort of think about how you could get involved, whether that's with air pollution campaigning or any issue that affects you. Secondly, I am doing another plug to please sign our Glasgow petition. Again, I'll share the link in the chat. If you're sold that air pollution is a problem in Glasgow, please sign it. We need as many numbers as possible for our petition hand-in that we're doing later this year. You can also opt in or out to our emails there. If you opt in, you'll be kept updated with all of our Glasgow work. Number 3 is to get in touch. So if you want to know more, if you want to do more when it comes to air pollution in Glasgow, please do email me. We don't have that many active campaigners in Glasgow at the moment, so it would be really great just to be kept in the know, really. If you want to do more, I can support you with resources. But also, if you decide to campaign on this, just letting us know what you're up to and staying in touch would be really, really interesting. And lastly, get active. So I hope this presentation has made you see that campaigning locally can be really empowering and can create impacts. There was so much more I wanted to share, but it was just getting a little bit unwieldy. But there's a lot of good examples out there of really successful local campaigns. Do have a look. There's so many on the internet if you do a bit of searching, and it can be really inspiring to show you what can happen. So please have a think about what you can do. It can be a really small thing, as much as signing a petition, or it can be a big thing such as leading your own local campaign. But it's all important and it's all really worthwhile. And I think at a time like now, people can be feeling a little bit demotivated. So even just small things to help your community are so needed. Okay, thank you. That's everything. My email address is there. So if you want to take a quick screenshot or quickly write it down, you can do. But otherwise,